With the first crossover between series just released, unexpectedly recently, I thought I'd do more of a discussion video about the potential crossover events in recent Trek series and how the older shows tackled this. For a start, back in the Next Generation era, we had a lot more crossover than we do now, and that was for quite a simple premise: the setting. While the occasional true crossover featured casts from the different shows interacting, the bigger implications were the events that folded out of them. TNG took place from the years 2364 to 70, and overlapped with both Voyager and Deep Space Nine. Beginning with the Borg encounter in the episode Q Who, the establishing of one of the greatest threats to the Federation was made with the follow-up attack on Sector 001 resulting in the Battle of Wolf 359. It was out of this disastrous confrontation that Deep Space Nine's Commander Sisko emerged, followed in later episodes of DS9 from things like the USS Defiant. The Borg threat was one that would begin to shape Starfleet overall, and we began to see the implementation of darker uniforms and more advanced starships like the USS Voyager. The uniform tone of Starfleet added to differentiate DS9, which began in the year 2369 and towards the end of TNG's run, meaning that the series' events were running concurrently with Series 6 of the Next Generation. TNG maintained the look it had established to differentiate the show both in lore and real life, but even these newer uniforms began to creep into the crew by the first of the sequel films, Star Trek Generations. This also saw the loss of the Federation's poster vessel, the Enterprise D, as times began to grow darker for Starfleet and the threat of the Dominion grew. A theme that has been brought up in TNG was also the retreat of Cardassia from Bajor and the issue brought to the limelight by Ensign Ro Laren, among other mentions, as well as the attention drawn to the Federation's own border wars with the Cardassian Union in the past. While the Enterprise carried on with its missions all over the place, these issues were set up as recurring parts of the larger Trek universe. Of course, Deep Space Nine was now set on a station orbiting Bajor, so these once background problems were elevated to be the centre stage for this series early on. In 2371, the uniform look was carried over to Star Trek Voyager, which launched from Deep Space Nine. Not only that, its first mission was to pursue and retrieve a Maquis crew, the Maquis being a renegade faction of former Federation citizens who fight against Cardassia despite the UFP's efforts for peace. Not here to discuss the morality of their choice in this video, but the Maquis issue began in 2370 with both Deep Space Nine having the two-parter formation of the Maquis, but it also being apparent that this was an event long simmering, now fulminating. Then, in the same year, TNG saw Ensign Ro defect to join the Maquis herself in preemptive strike. As mentioned, Voyager launched a year later in pursuit of a Maquis ship, Chakotay's cell, before it was whisked away to the Delta Quadrant, and in the span of 5 years we saw Starfleet's tone grow darker as the universe seemed to batter the organisation with the Borg, dissension, and then the loss of its flagship, then the Dominion War erupted. This was the most major event in recent Federation history and became the stable narrative of DS9's later seasons. However, Next Generation had finished by this point, so its more optimistic tone was spared, and so too was Voyager. While in dire straits of its own, Voyager was completely spared the Dominion War for the most part. In the post-TNG films, however, while we began in 2373 in a confrontation with the Borg, we saw a new Enterprise alongside many new combat-oriented Starfleet ships. The Defiant even makes an appearance as one of the vessels sent to intercept the Borg so as to reintroduce Worf to the cast. These new ships, and the new tougher grey shoulder uniforms, would then go on to feature in Star Trek DS9, continuing to add to the shared universe feel. The Dominion War ended in 2375, but the scars Starfleet had continued on, as did the new looks to the ships and technology. Even Star Trek Voyager, mostly self-contained thanks to its vast distance, was not completely untouched by the events, with Project Pathfinder in 2376 showing us looks into Starfleet still maintaining that image. It's then that the crew learn of the destruction of the Marquis, and there is then a subplot about how that affects the crew that were a part of that push. When Voyager returns home, however, they do so through Borg transwarp conduits, and a Federation fleet is mobilised to intercept the corridor, only to have Voyager emerge in 2378. A year later, we see that Janeway is now in the Admiralty and flying a desk in Star Trek Nemesis. Cameos aside, from TNG through to Star Trek Nemesis, we had a growing and changing Star Trek universe where events in one series affected another down the line or even at the same time, as with the Marquis plotline and DS9's adoption of First Contact's ships and styles. Now, with current Star Trek, we have much less of this in my opinion, and this is from a number of factors. The most notable one is simply the settings. Discovery was in 2254 and then the far, far future. Picard was set at the turn of the 25th century, 2399 to 2402. Lower Decks and Prodigy are closest to one another in the timeline, but Prodigy was, like Voyager, a mostly self-contained series and also very loose with its canon. Lower Decks has been unrepentantly funny in both how it plays homage and mocks Star Trek and its tropes, often from the point of view of a viewer, which has carried it much favour with me, and many others. Initially, I was always concerned with how the series would portray its humour, as a comedy show needs to fit into a universe that supports such comedy, and the Star Trek setting, while having its comedic moments, is not generally such a setting. However, Lower Decks has done the most, I feel, to connect to a larger Trek universe. Looking at its setting, we can see why. It started only 2 years after Nemesis, and while it has a very different look, the uniforms and the tone, there was a reason given, and we see in flashbacks and on other vessels that the Starfleet we saw in the tail end of DS9 is still there. Captain Riker is introduced, canonising the Lunar class USS Titan, which we never got to see in Nemesis, only hear about, and we get cameos of recognisable characters. However, as has been said before, Lower Decks too does not seek to radically shake up the larger Trek universe. So it's kind of funny that this show feels the most connected to the larger mythos than the others. The crossover with Strange New Worlds was fantastic and did much for me to actually unify the cartoony style and tone with the larger Trek universe. In terms of canon, I take an unreliable narrator approach to Lower Decks, with the events unfolding as canonical, but retold in a more humorous fashion and exaggeration for comedic effect. This would sort of be proven with the crossover for me, as we see both Boimler and Mariner acting in pretty much the same fashion, just a little less exaggerated. Star Trek Picard made a conscious effort to stay away from its TNG precursor for seasons 1 and 2, and while I get it, I feel this was not the correct choice, as do many others. It did, however, include ships from the late 24th century in Season 2, as well as introducing newer designs pulled from Star Trek Online. When it did embrace its legacy in the final season, there were so many tie-ins and crossovers it was borderline fan service, but undoubtedly one of my favourites of the new Trek era. However, while I appreciate the additional vessels from Star Trek Online making an appearance, it would have also been nice to see ships from Lower Decks crawl into the lore too. The Parliament class, the Urbana class, for example, were fairly new vessels for the 2380s, and should be seen 20 years later on in other shows. As for the uniforms, it does not help that we keep getting new variations for every show. Each series wants to create its own look, but I'm forced to ask, why? There seem to be a myriad of uniforms in the post-TNG era, with the familiar Dominion War era greys, the Lower Decks style white border foldovers, the borderless foldovers from Prodigy, and the Picard flashback shoulder stripes from 2385. While not exactly unbelievable that styles would change so drastically, it creates a disconnectedness between the shows. Finally, Strange New Worlds spun out of Series 2 of Star Trek Discovery, and although it strives very much to establish its own tone and look, as it is closer to the original series era, it acts as a more efficient prequel than Discovery did. Discovery did a lot wrong in Season 1. It tried to have its cake and eat it by both being a prequel to the original series and radically overhauling everything, including adding major lore implications into a fairly well-established setting. Strange New Worlds, however, is still impacted by the events of Discovery to an extent, notably Pike's fate and the fact that there was recently a Klingon Federation war. But this is far closer to feeling in line with TOS era, which is also funny considering its timeline shenanigans. So, in essence, I have enjoyed it whenever newer Trek shows its interconnectedness with the larger franchise as a whole, and it pays off more often than not. Again, I'm not talking about references and Easter eggs, but whenever the shows make a concerted effort to abide by an established larger picture. While the Trek universe is large enough to hold a multitude of different stories, it also behooves it to maintain its integrity and continuity within its canon. For example, Star Trek Picard established a very rough time for the Federation in 2385, when most of its ship production was halted for the Romulan evacuation fleet that was then lost along with its primary shipyard. This is only 3 or so years away from Lower Decks, for an example. This is also one of the reasons I'm not too sad to see Prodigy ending, as its setting would further clutter up this time zone too, and I don't feel like it would have stuck to the events set forth in Picard. I hope the Lower Decks Strange New Worlds crossover is a sign that these disparate series are going to be communicating more together to forge a cohesive universe, because for me, Star Trek is often greater than the sum of its parts, especially when those parts are working in cohesion.